I never thought much about the attic when I first moved into the house. It was a small, older home at the edge of town, tucked away on a quiet street. The kind of place you could easily overlook if you weren't paying attention. The price was right, and I needed something affordable after my last apartment had been, well, let's just say it didn't work out. The house had an undeniable charm. The tall windows let in lots of sunlight, and the hardwood floors creaked pleasantly underfoot. It was cozy, quiet, and most importantly, mine. The attic, however, wasn't something I paid any attention to. I figured I'd deal with it when I needed extra space or storage. After all, there were more pressing things on my mind: unpacking, settling in, and just adjusting to the change. The attic was locked when I first moved in. The previous owners hadn't mentioned anything about it. Nothing unusual anyway. Just that it was an old space and not worth bothering with. I didn't mind. There was more than enough room in the rest of the house for me to get settled. I had my own bedroom, a decent-sized kitchen, and a small living room. The attic could wait. Weeks went by without a thought about the room above. It wasn't until I was unpacking some old boxes that I noticed something odd. There was a strange, almost imperceptible sound coming from the attic. Something faint, like tapping or scraping. At first, I told myself it was just the wind or maybe the house settling. These old homes do that, right? The floors creak, the walls groan, and the windows whistle in the wind. But then the sound came again. It wasn't quite tapping. It was like something was moving around up there. Slow, deliberate movements, as if someone were dragging something heavy across the floor. The sound was unsettling, but I pushed it out of my mind. I had no reason to believe anything was amiss, but the noises grew more frequent, more distinct. It happened late at night, when everything else in the house was still. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening as the scraping or dragging would continue above my head. Sometimes it would go on for hours. I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, after hearing the sound once again, I decided to investigate. I had to know what it was. I took a flashlight and made my way up to the attic door. It had a heavy, old brass lock on it, and for the first time I wondered why it was there in the first place. I didn't have a key, but curiosity got the better of me. I found a crowbar in the garage, thinking I could at least pry the lock open and see what was going on. It wasn't as easy as I thought. The door was old, and the lock was rusty. It took more force than I expected, and when it finally gave way, the door creaked open with a harsh, echoing groan. A cloud of dust and stale air hit me in the face, and I stepped back, coughing. The attic was dark, save for the beam of my flashlight. The space was larger than I had imagined, filled with old, dusty furniture and boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. My flashlight swept over the area, illuminating the shadows, but there was no sign of anyone or anything unusual. The noises, however, hadn't stopped. They were still there, coming from the far corner of the attic. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving around in the dark. I stood there, frozen for a moment. My heart was racing. I almost turned back, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But something urged me forward, pulling me closer to the sound. I walked cautiously toward the corner, where I saw an old dresser, its drawers partially open. And then, I saw it. There was a piece of wire, thin and frayed, stretching across the floor from the dresser. I bent down, following it with my flashlight. It led to a small, heavy-looking metal box, tucked away under the dresser. The scraping sound had stopped, but now there was an odd feeling in the air, a sense of being watched. I reached out and touched the box. It was cold, and the metal felt heavy beneath my fingers. I hesitated, but I had to know what was inside. I opened it. Inside was a collection of old tools, nothing out of the ordinary. but there was something odd about them. They were worn, covered in rust, and some of them seemed too small for any practical use. But there was one item that stood out. A long, narrow blade wrapped in a piece of cloth. It looked like it had been deliberately hidden, tucked away among the other items. My stomach dropped as I stared at it. I pulled it out and examined it. The blade was sharp, almost too sharp. It had been carefully cared for, its edges gleaming even under the dim light. But what struck me was the handle. It was made of some kind of dark wood, almost black, with intricate carvings along its length. As I traced my fingers over it, a chill ran down my spine. The carvings were strange, abstract, almost jagged, as though they had been made in haste. I stood there, staring at the blade, when I suddenly heard something behind me. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder. Footsteps. Someone was moving toward me. My heart skipped a beat, and I whipped around, but the attic was empty. There was nothing there. My pulse quickened as I looked back at the box, but the footsteps had stopped. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like I wasn't alone, despite there being no one there. I grabbed the box and, without thinking, ran out of the attic, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't stop until I was back in the living room, my breath ragged in my chest. My hands were shaking, still holding the box. I set it down on the table and stared at it for a while, unsure of what to do next. I knew something was wrong. The feeling that had settled over me wasn't just my imagination. This wasn't a simple attic with old furniture and forgotten items. There was something here, something that didn't want to be found. I left the box in the living room that night, and when I woke the next morning, it was gone. I searched the entire house, the attic included, but the box was nowhere to be found. The tools were gone, and the blade had vanished without a trace, as though it had never existed. But the whispers never stopped. At first, it was only faint, the sound of dragging, scraping, like someone, was pacing back and forth above me. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the house. But as the days wore on, the noises got louder, clearer. I could hear them now, even during the day. The dragging would start in the afternoon, just when the house was quietest, and it would continue until dusk. I began to grow paranoid. The more I heard the noises, the more I felt like I was being watched. Sometimes I would hear faint whispers, like muffled voices from behind the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the tone, an angry, insistent whisper that seemed to grow sharper each time. One night, as I was lying in bed, wide awake, I heard the scraping again. But this time it was closer. The sound was moving across the ceiling, directly above me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the ceiling, listening. The scraping stopped. Then, a thud. The unmistakable sound of something heavy falling. I jumped out of bed and ran up to the attic, fueled by a mixture of fear and curiosity. When I opened the attic door, it was dark. My flashlight illuminated the room. The dresser was still there, but something had changed. It was no longer pushed up against the wall. It had been moved a few inches to the left. I couldn't breathe. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was the trail. A trail of dark, wet marks led from the dresser to the floor beneath it. And in the center of the room, right where the box had been, was the blade. Only now it wasn't the same blade I had seen before. It was covered in something dark, something that looked like dried blood. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the blade, and then I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't coming from above. They were coming from behind me. The house wasn't the same anymore. It had changed, and it was as if the house was waiting for me to figure out why. The whispers were louder now. They were coming from the walls, and they knew my name. Leave. I couldn't leave. Not now. Not with the house watching me, listening to every step I took. I didn't know who or what was in here with me, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't going to let me leave that easily. I never believed in ghosts. I was always the kind of person who brushed off supernatural stories as overactive imaginations or the product of a good horror novel. If people told me about something eerie or strange happening in their house, I'd nod politely and change the subject. I didn't believe in things like hauntings, spirits, or whatever else people might claim. I was grounded in reality, and I thought the idea of a house being haunted was just ridiculous. But that was before I moved into my new house. It was a small, old house at the edge of town. I didn't mind the age of it. In fact, I kind of liked it. It had character, the kind of character you don't get in modern homes. The house had creaky floors, windows that wouldn't open properly, and a smell that I can only describe as old. It wasn't unpleasant, just that musty, dusty scent that comes with age. The house was affordable, and I figured it would be a nice place to settle into while I figured out my next steps in life. The attic was one of the first things I noticed when I moved in. I remember standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the old wooden door leading into the attic. It had a thick, rusted latch on it, and the stairs leading up there were narrow and steep. It looked like a part of the house that had been long forgotten. There was a sort of air of mystery about it, like the attic had its own secrets. I told myself that I'd take a look once I got settled in, but there was something about it that made me hesitate. After the first few days, I started to hear strange sounds coming from upstairs at night. It wasn't much at first. A creak here and there, a muffled thud as if something had shifted. But it wasn't just the house settling. No, these sounds were different. They sounded deliberate, like someone was walking around up there. At first, I brushed it off. Old houses creak, right? Maybe there were squirrels in the walls or something. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But that night, the sounds grew louder. It was almost like someone was pacing back and forth above me. The slow, rhythmic thump of footsteps dragging across the attic floor. It was the kind of noise that made your skin crawl. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the footsteps were too measured, too human. I tried to ignore it, but the sound wouldn't stop. It went on for hours. I could feel my pulse racing as the noise above me continued, dragging, slow and steady. I eventually got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight and headed up to the attic. I had to know what it was. The door to the attic creaked as I pulled the latch open, and I stepped onto the stairs. The air in the attic was cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the rest of the house. As I reached the top, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The flashlight in my hand flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The room was smaller than I expected, dimly lit by the small window on the far side with dust floating in the air. There was nothing in the attic but old furniture covered in sheets and a few cardboard boxes. I scanned the room, but there was no sign of anyone, no sign of anything. I was about to turn back when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing in the farthest corner of the attic, barely visible in the shadows. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe some old furniture cast in a strange shadow. But as I looked closer, I realized the shape wasn't furniture. It was a person, a man. He was tall and thin, his clothes ragged and covered in dust. His face was pale, almost sickly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at me, unblinking. His lips were cracked and dry, as though he hadn't spoken in years. and his skin was pale, almost translucent. I don't know how long I stood there staring at him. It felt like hours, though I'm sure it was only a few seconds. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. Was I dreaming? Was I imagining things? Then, without a word, he moved. He stepped out of the shadows, his feet dragging slowly across the wooden floor. Each step sounded like a death knell, like he was walking on an old grave. The sound of his feet scraping the floor echoed in my ears, and my heart began to race. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. My body wouldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, unable to run or even breathe properly. The man didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes, as if waiting for me to do something. I didn't know what he wanted. I didn't know what he was. Finally, I turned and ran. I didn't even think. I just bolted down the stairs, slamming the door behind me. My mind was spinning, my breath coming in short gasps as I scrambled to get away from whatever that thing was. I went straight to my bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the footsteps didn't stop. They started again, slow and dragging, just like before. I could hear them above me, moving from one side of the attic to the other, pacing back and forth. I couldn't escape the sound. I was frozen in fear, my heart pounding in my chest, my body trembling as I sat on the floor, unable to move. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the footsteps stopped. Just like that. Silence. It felt unnatural. The house felt wrong. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the footsteps to start again. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the attic, what he wanted, why he was there. The look in his eyes, like he was waiting for me. I tried to convince myself it was all just a nightmare, that I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew what I had seen. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it had all been some kind of dream. I went to work and tried to go about my day like everything was normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back to the attic to look around again, hoping I'd find something that explained what happened. But the room was just as it had been before, empty, dusty, and silent. There was no sign of anyone, no sign of the man. But when I went back downstairs, I heard it again, the dragging footsteps. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, moving across the attic, slow and deliberate. It was like he was right there, above me, just waiting for me to come back. I called a friend that afternoon, telling him everything. He thought I was overreacting, that it was just my nerves, that old houses made strange noises. He suggested I spend the night at his place and take a break from the house. I agreed. That night, I stayed at my friend's house. I thought I could finally get some rest, but at around 2 a.m., I heard it. The footsteps. They were clearer now, closer, and they weren't coming from the attic. They were coming from the hallway outside my friend's room. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just lay there, heart hammering in my chest, listening to the slow, dragging footsteps get closer and closer. I knew I had to leave. But before I could make a sound, the footsteps stopped. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and left. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the house or the things I'd left behind. I just wanted out. I never went back to that house. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the footsteps. Slow, dragging, like someone is still walking around up there. I don't know who or what the man in the attic was, but I know one thing. He was waiting for me. And I'll never forget the feeling that he's still there, watching, waiting. It was a quiet Wednesday night when I first heard about the killer on the news. I was sprawled out on the couch, flipping between channels, too tired to focus on anything for long. A bottle of beer sat half empty beside me, and the dull hum of the TV was the only noise filling the otherwise silent house. The news anchor's voice suddenly caught my attention. Police are still searching for the suspected serial killer known as the Night Strangler. Authorities are urging residents to stay alert as the killer has evaded capture for over a week. His last known victim was found in a nearby town, and investigators believe he's still hiding in the area. I leaned forward, intrigued. The image on the screen was grainy, showing a blurry photograph of a man. He looked ordinary enough. Dark hair, average height, wearing a plain shirt and jeans. But there was something unsettling about his eyes, something hollow that seemed to stare right through you. I had heard rumors about the killings, but I hadn't paid much attention. I was more concerned about my own life. Working, fixing up the house, just getting by. But hearing the details now, my curiosity grew. The killer had evaded the police for so long, which meant he was smart and dangerous. I turned the volume up slightly as the anchor continued to describe the crime scenes. Each victim found strangled in their homes, each with a strange symbol carved into their skin. I didn't catch the full details, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know. It was chilling. I tried to shake it off, but the thought of the killer, so close to where I lived, gnawed at me. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I grabbed a few snacks, watched a couple of reruns, and eventually went to bed around midnight. My house was a small, two-bedroom place on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it was all I could afford. I didn't mind. It was quiet, secluded, the kind of place where you could forget about the rest of the world. At least, that's how it had felt up until that point. I hadn't been asleep for long when I was jolted awake by a sound, a faint creaking, like someone stepping lightly on the floor. My heart skipped. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. My first thought was that it was a burglar. The attic door in the corner of the room had been creaking for weeks, the old hinges groaning whenever the wind shifted. But this sound, this was different. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the house settling. It was something, or someone, moving. I sat there in the dark, my breath shallow. The room was silent again, but the air felt thick with tension. My mind raced, running through possibilities. Could it be an intruder? Someone had broken in and was now hiding in the attic. I didn't know, but I wasn't about to find out right away. I grabbed my phone and called the police. But then I hesitated. What would I say? That I thought someone might be in my attic? I couldn't just accuse anyone based on a creak in the floor. So I hung up, telling myself I was being paranoid. I lay back down, trying to push the thought from my mind, but sleep wouldn't come. Every small noise made me jump. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the eaves of the house. The sound of scraping continued in the attic, a rhythmic drag that seemed to match the beat of my racing heart. My muscles were tight, my body frozen in place. I could hear it now, slow and deliberate, like someone moving around or dragging something heavy. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was well past 2 in the morning when I finally decided to check. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer beside my bed, my fingers trembling as I turned it on. I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck. The attic was above the hallway, just past the bathroom. It wasn't a big space, but it was isolated, and I had never felt comfortable going up there. I stood at the bottom of the stairs leading to the attic door, my flashlight illuminating the dark. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible beyond it. I could feel the air in the hallway grow colder, and I realized my hands were shaking. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. A raccoon, maybe. A rodent. A squirrel. Something harmless that had gotten stuck up there. But the closer I got to the door, the more the air seemed to close in around me. Then I heard it again. A scraping. A movement. The sound of something, or someone, moving in the attic. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The attic was even darker than I expected. Dust filled the air, making the beam of my flashlight look like a solid line slicing through the darkness. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stepped inside, and I tried not to make any noise, not to alert whatever might be up there to my presence. My eyes darted around looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. I was about to turn around and leave when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. It moved quickly across the far wall, just beyond the range of my flashlight. I froze. I wasn't alone. I could feel the hairs on my neck stand up, my breath coming in short bursts. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned toward the far side of the attic. The beam of my flashlight landed on a stack of old boxes, and for a second I thought I saw something shift beneath them. I slowly moved toward it, my mind racing. What if there was a person up here? What if the killer was hiding in my attic right now? Suddenly, the scraping noise came again, much louder this time. It sounded like someone dragging something across the floor. I turned toward the source of the noise and saw it. A man, crouched behind a pile of old furniture, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with madness. I gasped, my hand trembling as I raised the flashlight toward him. He didn't move. Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice shaky with fear. The man didn't speak. Instead, he stood up slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural, like he hadn't moved in days. His clothes were dirty, his hair matted to his forehead. There was something wild about him, something that made my skin crawl. And then I saw it. The knife. He was holding a large, serrated knife, the blade glinting in the light. His hands were covered in something. Blood. I backed away, my heart thudding in my chest. My mind raced. The man on the news, the night strangler, the one the police were looking for. He was right here, in my attic. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The man took a step toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. His lips twisted into a smile that wasn't a smile, more of a grimace, like he was savoring the fear in my eyes. I barely registered the sound of the footsteps on the stairs behind me. My gaze shot toward the attic door, and I saw another figure standing in the doorway, a police officer. He looked at me, then at the man in the attic, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But before he could draw it, the man lunged, swinging the knife with terrifying speed. The officer barely had time to react. There was a flash of silver, and then the officer went down, his body crumpling to the floor. I screamed. The man turned his attention back to me, his smile widening. I ran. I don't remember much after that. I ran down the stairs, out of the house, into the night. I barely even noticed the cars parked down the street, the lights flashing. I think I screamed the whole way there. I just couldn't stop running. By the time the police arrived and the house was cleared, the man was gone. They found the officer, alive but barely, and rushed him to the hospital. As for me, I never went back to that house. The police combed through the attic, but the man was never found again. I don't know what happened to him. All I know is that he was up there, hiding in the shadows, just above my head, watching me. And every time I think back to that night, I can't shake the image of his eyes, wide and hollow, staring at me from the dark. I wonder sometimes if he's still out there, waiting.